Hello, my name's Peter Watkins. Thank you very much for joining me for this Insights on Demand event. We're going to be talking about reading, and in particular the research on reading. So I will just quickly share my screen with you now, and hopefully you will be able to see my presentation, in which will start in just a second. There we are. So we're going to talk about research and reading. And what does the research tell us about reading and how we go about the teaching of reading? Obviously, there's a lot of research on reading, and we would need a whole conference to discuss all of it. So I've just chosen three related areas. The first of all, we're going to look at extensive reading. We're going to look at reading fluency, and we're going to look at reading and motivation, because in the end, like any skill, we need our learners to be sufficiently motivated to want to do the reading. Because the only way they will in the end get better at reading is by doing quite a lot of reading. But before we get into the actual teaching side of it, I just want to say a couple of words about reading generally. This is from a report from 2018, and I can obviously, you can read it for yourselves what's written there, but I just want to highlight one or two key quotes from this, if you like. In the first line, reading is such a powerful force for good that it can change people's lives. Reading changes people's lives. And if you look down towards the bottom, it says it connects people, strengthens communities, it improves our prospects, shapes our life chances, and helps us manage our health and well-being. Now, that last claim about health and well-being is based on a self-report method of research, where those who reported doing quite a lot of reading also reported less loneliness and being less lonely, which is obviously a good thing for mental health. And that was before the lockdown, of course, in 2018. So reading really is an amazing thing that shapes our lives. But actually, is that the experience of our learners in our classrooms? I have to say, when I teach reading lessons, it's not always the experience. I don't sense that my learners have that sense of wonder at reading and magic. This is typically, I think, how most reading lessons work out in a classroom. I hope you some of you at least are able to sort of recognize that formula, if you like, through which we teach reading. So the teacher generally sort of starts by building interest in the topic, which is obviously a good idea and maybe quite motivating for students. Quite often we pre-teach a bit of vocabulary at the start. That's probably because we think the text is a bit difficult otherwise. Typically, we have a quick reading task, a skimming or a scanning type task at the beginning, and then learners read a second time for more detailed information, typically answering multiple choice questions, true, false questions, those sorts of things. We check the answers, and I think we breathe a huge sigh of sort of collective relief that it's over and we can move the lesson on to something else, usually a discussion which is in some way or other related to the topic of the reading, but maybe not all that closely related, but you know, the reading's done. And when I look at this, and when I think about the lessons I've taught, but also lessons I've seen many people teach lessons according to this sort of formula, it's quite noticeable how little time in a lesson that's billed as a reading lesson, how little time that students might actually spend reading. And it doesn't have to be like this. So, you know, there are other things. Now, I should say straight away, I'm not saying that we should necessarily ditch what we do and stop doing what I've just described. But we also need more than that. We can do better than that. Here's a quote from Grabe and Stoller. Becoming a good reader requires reading a lot and reading often. There are simply no shortcuts. There really aren't. You know, if you want to be good at something, you have to do it and you have to keep doing it. So as I say, we don't have to have that sort of reading lesson that we saw before, which is fairly predictable. And it actually runs across levels in most course books, for example, and that's what you can see on the left there, the intensive reading. We use relatively short text. They're relatively difficult for learners. They're very accuracy focused. We test what the learners have understood, and we look at details within the text and can they extract that detail. But there's another model, extensive reading, where the focus is on reading actually quite large quantities of text, but relatively easy text. So there's more of a focus on fluency than accuracy. Quite often with extensive reading, there's either no testing at all or very little testing. And advocates of extensive reading would claim that reading is a pleasurable activity, that it is its own reward, if you like. So I'm not saying we should not do intensive reading, but we should consider adding in and doing better than intensive reading and having extensive reading so that our learners get to do plenty of reading. But the obvious thing is, well, what is the evidence for extensive reading? Does it work? Well, let's have a look at the research. Extensive reading leads to improvements in reading rate and comprehension. Now, the reading rate, you may be not surprised, it's a fluency focused activity with relatively easy texts. But even when, after an extensive reading program, even when learners go back and do that sort of more detailed reading, the intensive reading we talked about, comprehension has improved. So it's not just about improving reading fluency, it's also about more accuracy and more comprehension. So reading improves, perhaps you'd say not surprisingly, because it's an extensive reading program, but also vocabulary improves. So vocabulary growth, there's plenty of research to support this as well. Now, we should also remember it's not just about the number of words people are learning, but extensive reading can also help with the quality of knowledge, not just the number of words, but the quality of knowledge about those words. I'm thinking of things like collocation, what words go together. I'm thinking about things like connotation, what particular contexts are words used in? Are they particularly formal or informal? Those kinds of things that are actually quite difficult to explicitly teach. Learners will pick up and develop the quality of their knowledge through multiple exposures with these words. So we've got improvements to reading, we've got improvements to vocabulary. Extensive reading also leads to improvements in writing skills. Well, plenty of evidence for that as well. Extensive reading leads to improvements in grammar. And Day and Bamford point out that and claim that extensive reading may be more motivating than sort of traditional classroom reading activities. So if you think about that, there's a huge amount of strong evidence to support extensive reading. Ellis and Shintani from 2014 say there's plenty of evidence to support the claim that learning, especially of vocabulary, does occur through extensive reading. Plenty of evidence. But Hedgecock and Ferris go a bit further than that, actually, and say rarely in language education do we find a teaching approach, that's extensive reading that they're talking about, do we find a teaching approach that is so universally hailed as beneficial, important, and necessary, yet is so underutilized and even ignored in curriculums, in course design, in lesson design, in materials development? So what are Hedgecock and Ferris saying here? Essentially, everyone knows from the research that extensive reading is really, really useful and works, and nobody does it. So is there anything we can do to try and ease the way in which extensive reading programs might be implemented, and how can we go about setting up extensive reading programs? Well, the first thing is we need to make sure we provide plenty of graded material, because we want the reading to be relatively easy. So it's important that the material is graded and that it's relatively easy. Now, some teachers often tell me that they do have reading material available. It's in a library, in a resources area, something like that. Of course, increasingly as well, available online. But the learners don't really engage with it. They don't read the stuff that is available to them. So I think we need to actually promote it a bit more. Take some books, read the opening section from different books. Yeah, put 5-10 minutes aside in class to read the first few paragraphs of something, and try to get learners to predict what's going to come next. Do they like it? Would they be interested in finding out what comes next? Those sorts of things. Or show the learners the covers of the books, illustrations to do with the books, to try and get them involved and think about whether they would be interested in this book. Wherever possible, try and integrate reading into a broader curriculum. Most extensive reading, because it is quite time consuming, Gaver and Ramirez recommend about 20 minutes to 30 minutes a day in a second language for extensive reading to be likely to work. So it's going to be largely done at home. So we need to perhaps explain the benefits to parents and caregivers. Obviously, I'm talking now about if we're teaching primary or secondary school kids. So if we're teaching children, we need to get their parents, their caregivers invested in the program, explain the benefits to them and say, this is why we think your kid should get involved with this. We want learners to read things that they find relatively easy. So one thing I do with my learners is teach them what I call a readability test. So what they do for that is simply take, say, a graded reader that's available to them. They open it at more or less any page and they count 100 words. They count 100 words. They then look back at those 100 words and decide how many of those words they recognize, how many do they already know. If they don't know more than 4 or 5, then the book is probably too difficult for them, and the advice would be to select something a bit easier. So we want learners to be able to read things that they find relatively easy, that they can read fluently, and you can teach them a simple little test so they are selecting materials that are appropriate for them, perhaps. Most of us find test taking quite anxiety provoking, and one of the things about that intensive model of reading that I described earlier, the sort of typical classroom type reading we go through, is that essentially what we do is test learners. We give them a text, we then test how many details, what details they've managed to extract from it. But that can be quite anxiety provoking, particularly for weaker readers. So maybe for extensive reading, we don't go for that form of assessment. Maybe what we can do is assess the process of reading. And what I mean by that is just we trust the research to work. We trust the research. And what we do is simply say that as long as we can assess whether the learners are engaging with the program and actually doing some reading, as long as they're doing the reading, we don't need to know much else, because we will trust the research to work for them as it does for so many other people. Another thing that can be quite motivating and is quite important in setting up a reading program is I think it's important for teachers to share what they have read in a second language as well, and how reading in a second language has benefited them, so that the teacher becomes a bit of a role model for reading. And it's important that reading is valued in class and time put aside to discuss reading and what people are reading. Now, I'm not talking about, I know that most teachers are really, really busy, and there's quite often a curriculum that's pressing on them to do more and more stuff, and it's difficult to fit it in. But I'm not saying necessarily for whole lessons, but you can talk about what people are reading outside the lesson in a few minutes at the start of a lesson or a few minutes at the end of the lesson, but make sure that what people are reading outside the class is valued and recognized, and they have a chance to at least say what they're doing. And for me, for what I tend to do with my learners is I'm not so sure, if I'm absolutely honest, that although I'm a big believer in extensive reading, I'm not sure that for many people, reading in a second language is necessarily pleasurable, as many advocates of extensive reading claim. So for me, for example, I'm trying to learn Spanish. My Spanish is okay. It's not great by any means, really. It is not great. But I try and do a bit of reading because I know it's good for me. But actually, whether I find it pleasurable, probably not so much, if I'm absolutely honest. You know, Netflix and a bottle of wine is pleasurable. Um, Reading in a second language, stories that are very graded, stories where the characters are pretty two-dimensional, the plot is pretty simple. I wouldn't say I find it a great pleasure, but I know it benefits me. So explain the benefits of extensive reading to learners. And this is how I do it. I give learners a set of statements like this. Now, normally when I do it, I have a Likert scale of sort of agree to disagree, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm sure you know the sort of thing after each statement. I didn't put that here because I wanted to be able to fit it onto one slide. But I give my learners a set of statements like this. They decide whether they agree or disagree with the statements. They then discuss them amongst themselves. So we get a little speaking activity, and then we discuss as a class. But of course, what it really is an excuse for me to talk about the benefits of extensive reading and say to my learners, look, do you want more grammar? Do you want more vocabulary? Do you want better writing? And if the answer to that is yes, and for most learners, let's be honest, that is what they want, then extensive reading might be the thing for them. Okay, let's move on. And we're going to move on to something which is strongly related to extensive reading, because we're going to look at reading fluency. And Graber, there 2009 says reading fluency is what good readers do on a continual basis with almost all the material they encounter, and it's an essential component of reading comprehension. Now, this is the key point, that last little bit of the quote, it is an essential component of reading comprehension. The same with the Clowder and Guthrie quote at the bottom there, that actually what we find is that as learners become more fluent, so they become more accurate. So reading fluency really is absolutely crucial to developing as becoming a better reader, essentially. But if you think about it, in most of our classrooms, how much emphasis do we put on actually aiming to develop reading fluency? I don't think a great deal, if I'm honest. There's a consensus that reading fluency is vital. Okay, yes, I've put a couple of sources there for that. But so how would we develop it? Well, we've already talked about extensive reading. So I'm obviously, extensive reading is one way which will help to develop reading fluency. It helps to develop all sorts of other reading skills as well, not just fluency, but it will help fluency. A couple of other things that I'm just going to highlight that also help to develop fluency. One is word recognition and vocabulary building. Now, this cannot be underestimated. Vocabulary is absolutely crucial, absolutely essential for reading, reading comprehension, fluent reading, accurate reading. Vocabulary is crucial. And what we need to do, there is a strong argument, to be honest, that says if you want to help your learners become better at reading, teach them a lot of vocabulary. But also, learners need to be able to recognize those words just about instantly. And that instant word recognition is absolutely fundamental in first language reading, and it's absolutely fundamental in second language reading. Learners need to be able to recognize words just about instantly. And one other thing that helps learners to develop reading fluency is rereading. Rereading the same text or a very, very similar text will help reading fluency to develop. So what I'm now going to do is share a couple of activities with you that might help with developing reading fluency. Okay, so you have to imagine at this point, if you can, you have to imagine that you are my beginner level class, you're A1, you have just started learning English, we've had a few lessons, and the lessons we've had, as you could probably work out if you look at the words on the screen, we've done numbers up to about 10 or maybe more, but we've got numbers, we've done colors, so we've got brown, gray, blue, yellow, green, and we've got days of the week. Okay, so the key point here is I'm using known vocabulary. These are words the students have already learned, okay? And then what we do is give each learner one of those sets of words. So when we can teach people face to face, we might give them a slip of paper with those words on, okay? But each learner gets a different set of, one set of these words. So they may get the blue set, the yellow set, the green set. And then what the teacher does, very simply, is start reading out the words in a seat, not from left to right, but just jumping around. So they may go 5, Saturday, 6, grey, brown, orange, Sunday, 10, yellow. And as the learner hears a word on their piece of paper, they read the word, they hear the word, they've decoded the word, they cross it out. And the winner is the first person or group of people in the class who cross out all the words. But the skill that they have to do to be able to cross out the words is to recognize those words instantly, because if they don't recognize them quickly, the teacher will have moved on and they will have missed something. And if they miss something, they won't win the game. So it's a simple game of bingo, essentially. Those of you know bingo. So as the first students cross out all the words, so they shout bingo. Very simple, but very, very useful, working on this instant word recognition and decoding. Okay, well, you were my A1 class. Now you've got to believe that, you know, we've had a few lessons and suddenly you're my B1 class, okay? You're suddenly a B1, even B2 level class, and we're going to do another little bit of reading. But before we do, there's a question for you. Do you know what film this is from, and the picture is from, and who the two actors are? Okay, so what film, two actors, you could put it in the chat now if you want. There really should be a prize. If you can get the film and both actors, there should be a prize, but I'm afraid I have to stress there is no prize. There should be a prize, but there is no prize. Okay, so who are the actors and what film is it from? Okay, many of you will probably have already realized that it was from Roman Holiday, and it's Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. Now, what we need to do, okay, you have to imagine that you're my intermediate class and we've done the standard lesson, all right? So I've asked you what your favorite film is and we've had a little bit of discussion. I may have taught you 2 or 3 words that are kind of come up in the text. We've got some multiple choice questions. You've answered the multiple choice questions. You've all got 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5, so you feel good about yourselves. Now, what generally happens at this point in the lesson is we all move on to something else. But I don't think that provides enough reading. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just now do an additional reading exercise that is very easy for teachers. It takes more or less no preparation at all. Very simple to do. Okay, all you have to do is follow me as I read it. I'm going to read it to you. All you have to do is follow. Okay, are you ready? I've just realized I've got to close the window down because I can't actually see the text. Okay. In some ways, Audrey Hepburn was a surprise choice to star in Roman Holiday, and the producers favoured Elizabeth Taylor. When Hepburn was, what's the next word? Tested for a much smaller role in the film, the director, William Wyler, was, next word? Was impressed, but could see that she was desperately nervous. Okay, we won't go on and do the whole thing. But what I hope you can see that is all I'm doing, all the teacher has to do is read the text a bit quicker than the students would naturally feel comfortable reading it. Don't forget, they have already read this text. So we're rereading it. This is about rereading, but we're pushing the students to process the text as quickly as possible. Okay. Now, I also threw in a little bit of a test for you about, you know, we could see if our learners are following, because if they are following, they'll know what the next word is going to be. Okay. Very easy for teachers to do, but real benefits to developing reading fluency, and developing reading fluency has a real impact on all forms of reading comprehension, reading accuracy as well. Okay, so one other reading fluency activity, okay? I'm going to just ask you to read that text. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to read that text, and I'll have a sip of water while you do it. Okay, hopefully you have been able to read that text. And now I'm going to show you a very similar text. And all you have to do is read the second text as well and decide what you think the main difference is between the two texts. Okay, it's the same information essentially, but what is the main difference between the new text and the one you've just read? Okay, so read this text. Okay, I think, don't worry if you haven't quite finished the text. But what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to do is get our learners to reread the text and identify some changes in the text. Now, if you wanted to make it, if you were making up a text, if a non-factual text, if you were using a fictional text, you could change one or two details in it and get the learners to locate the changes in that sort of sense. What I've done is I've changed the sort of stance of the text, and whereas the one on the left is actually quite neutral, the one in blue I tried to rewrite to make it a little more of a stance that I'm actually identifying the cause of the problem, and the cause of the problem is human beings, as opposed to it being more neutral on the left. Okay, but the key thing is here, what we're doing is providing a reason for our learners to reread text. And why is that important? Because rereading leads to better leads to gains in reading fluency, and not just gains for the text that you're actually rereading. Of course, if you reread the text a second time, you will have gains in fluency for that text, but those gains can be transferred to other texts, to new texts. Okay, and I just want to talk a little bit about motivating learners to read, because in the end, we're absolutely reliant on learners doing some reading. The only way they will become good at reading is through reading. So we need to motivate them to do it. And Komiyama suggests that we use a sort of model of self-determination theory, which was developed by Dechi and Ryan. And three components of self-determination theory are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Now, competence really is about feeling mastery, feeling good about something, feeling that you've achieved something. So if you think about what we said about extensive reading, the fact that learners can read the text and understand it without making a huge amount of effort actually is good for their feelings of competence. They actually feel like they're achieving something. And we could add in as well questions about things like, what have you learned about the world, so that you've actually from doing the reading, so that we build that sense of having achieved something from reading the text. Autonomy is heavily related to motivation. It seems that where learners are given choices over what they do, how they do it, that they become more motivated to do it. So we could think about giving learners a choice of texts to read. Again, that's exactly the principle of most extensive reading, where learners choose the text they want to read. But we could also think about giving learners a choice of task. You know, if we set a reading for homework, maybe not every learner has to do the same homework task. Maybe we could try and set 2 or 3 different homework tasks, and the learners choose which one they most want to do. And the other thing that really impacts on motivation is relatedness. And that really means about feeling part of a group and feeling part of something. So jigsaw reading activities would be good for that. I'm sure most of you know what jigsaw readings are, where some learners read one text or one part of a text, and the other learners read a different part of the text or a related text, and then they share information, they pool information. So we build in sort of a natural communication gap, pair and group work, and so on. The other way in which relatedness might build is if the teacher sort of shares their interest in reading, and there's a sort of community of reading developing. And I want to show just one activity which I think can help this sense of relatedness and making reading into more of a group endeavor as opposed to a fairly isolated individual process in class time. And this is called reading circles. So you select an appropriate text. It could well be from a course book. It doesn't have to be from outside the course book. It could be from the course book. and then you give each learner a different role. So you would have groups of 4. You would have the chair who manages the discussion and encourages people to take part. You have somebody who summarizes the overall meaning, something I've called a word wizard here, that makes sure that people, that person looks up the unknown words in the text and shares them with the rest of the group, and a connector who connects the text to other texts or to real life or any other connection they can find. Because actually, when we read, that is what we are doing. We're always connecting. As we read one bit of the text, we connect it to previous bits of the text or to knowledge we had outside that text, but we're always making connections. The new information is connected to existing information. So you don't have to have these roles exactly, of course. You could adapt them. If there are a lot of unknown words, you could have 2 people looking them up and sharing that burden and so on. But you can give different learners different roles so that they feel it's a part of a group endeavor. This idea, it has been used very successfully in L1 reading, in developing L1 reading, and quite often, or almost always actually, the things that help in first language reading also help in second language reading. So the chances are it would also help our learners very much indeed as well. Okay, I have got 1 or 2 things that you can read. There's a Cambridge paper on extensive reading in ELT, why and how. That's absolutely free. You can go to the Cambridge website and download that as a PDF. It's absolutely free. And there's one on extensive reading for primary in ELT as well. That is free. There is also a book on teaching and developing reading skills. I'm afraid that is not free. That is not free. That's why I put the other 2. The other 2 are free. The book isn't. There are the references that we've used today. And thank you very much indeed for listening. If you've got questions, I hope you've popped them into the chat. And thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at this Insights on Demand event. Thank you very much.